Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our webinar today, Explainable AI for Business Analytics, how a U.S. company harnessed AI and ML for improved business processes. I'm Tracy Gardner, Global Marketing Director of VLink Inc., and your host for today's webinar. Thanks for being here. I think you'll enjoy the next 30 minutes. It'll go by fast, so hang on to your chat. And we should have time at the end for Q&A, but definitely feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll answer them in real time as well. Artificial intelligence is making a significant impact in almost every industry. As AI ML gradually becomes part of our daily lives, the predictions being made by these large amounts of structured and unstructured data to perform near limitless tasks while applying problem solving and predictive analysis continues to grow. Today, we're going to share with you a case study on how one major industry leveraged AI to make data-driven decisions for saving lives. But before we get to that, let's do some introductions and talk about what is Explainable AI. Joining us for today's webinar are our esteemed panelists, Dr. Sudip Bhattacharjee, a professor in the School of Business at the University of Connecticut, and a senior research fellow at the U.S. Census Bureau. Dr. Sudip serves on several federal and professional advisory panels. His research has been highlighted in various media outlets, such as Business Week, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Christian Science Monitor, plus many others. Hameed currently works as a senior business consultant for VLink with 2 decades of experience in technology development and data engineering, and more than 8 years working with healthcare data and analytics, solving the data problems and helping organizations leap forward to the next data-driven innovations. In this webinar, we're going to discuss how AI and ML is a valuable tool for improving current data processes, helping to reduce costs and advancing outcomes. What you're going to learn today is what is explainable AI and why is it important? We'll look inside that AI black box. How is AI changing the decision making? What do leaders need to know? And implementation in any industry. Do I have the data for AI implementation? Will privacy and confidentiality hurt my ability to implement AI? So Dr. Sudip, now that we've made the introductions, let's start with you. Let's talk about explainable AI and why it's important.
Hey, Tracy, thank you very much. And good morning, everyone, to this webinar. So let's jump into what is explainable AI and why do we need it for business and society. We know that AI has made big strides and is in many areas in our life, for example, in our phones, in our driving, and in many facets of business. So let's try to understand the different elements that make up this AI ecosystem and then talk about explainable AI. Let's go to the next slide. In the area of AI, we talk about big data, we talk about machine learning and so on, right? So the name suggests big data, but the important part to remember is that size is not the only determinant that defines whether the data is good. The data, most importantly, needs to be valid. It needs to be reliable, and it needs to be fit for the purpose. That's the first input into the system. And then we get into the machine learning algorithms that need significant data to find patterns. Why? Because there may be patterns which may not be very evident to the modeler. And so we cannot give predetermined models, for example, y equals x1 plus x2, or another model like y equals x1 times x2. If we cannot give these predetermined models, we have to let the data and the model interact in a feedback loop to find the best model, to find the patterns which can be captured by the mathematical formula. And that is why the mathematical formulas become very complex. And when we go into artificial intelligence, which tries to mimic the human learning process, that can approach 10 billion neurons. Now think of the complexity, 10 billion variables, and then their interactions. And now try to understand how we can explain that complex model to others. That becomes very difficult. And that is where explainable AI becomes very, very important. Let's go to the next model. Next slide, Hameed. So why explainable AI? AI models typically focus on accuracy and performance, and they are extremely accurate in predicting what humans would want to do, for example. But this accuracy comes at a cost. Because these models are very complex, they are black box models, which means that we do not know what happens inside, and they are difficult to explain, and they are difficult to interpret for decision making. And most importantly for society, the models could be possibly biased and could be also unethical. And these are some of the forces that have now created the important factor of explaining the AI models, because it is now impacting society in many, many ways. So I'll give you some examples of AI models that actually did not work. So for example, around 2007, 2008, Netflix came up with a $1 million prize to give to a group that could increase the accuracy of its recommendation system by 10%. Now, the group that actually won the $1 million prize had an extremely complex model, which Netflix never used. And one of the reasons was that the model was so complex that it was difficult to understand what it was doing, and the model also was not very robust and reliable. Similarly, in the area of health that we are going to discuss today, Google Flu was a model of different areas of the US and their potential to get into the flu season. And Google created this model by looking at search terms in different areas. And they tried to throw the whole big data into the wall and try to see what would stick. And it turned out to be a complete failure, where it would over-predict and under-predict the flu season in different areas. And finally, Google Flu was withdrawn. Some other examples of AI in society and in business, for example, profiling systems in criminal justice using AI have over-predicted the rates of recidivism for Black defendants, which have raised questions about fairness in the system. Similarly, Amazon's recruiting engine showed bias against women, which also raised questions about fairness of AI. In a different area, we have all heard of self-driving cars that are AI-based. And so AI is making tangible decisions which have raised the accountability issues of who is responsible when, for example, there is a crash. In other cases, insurance decisions have been challenged when made by AI, and some states such as Massachusetts, Hawaii, and California have banned the use of credit-based insurance scores for underwriting because the system is not transparent. So what we see is that fairness, transparency, and accountability are three key factors that are affecting the explainability of AI. And that is the reason why CIOs, CTOs, CEOs, and other CXOs have demanded that AI needs to be explained, the inner workings need to be opened up so that we have confidence in the inner workings of the model, leading to the question of why does it work? And thankfully, there is significant work going on in explainable AI. So the way to build explainable AI models are increasingly part of government and corporate policy, and they fall within a framework of FAT with a E coming in recently. The FAT stands for fairness in the model, accountability of the model, and transparency of the system. And then ethics, of course, is a big part of it. How do we get to fairness? For example, when we talked about demographic and racial bias, that is brought in either by the data being fed into the system or the models that are being used in the system. So the first thing we have to do is to question, what is the source of my data? Is the underlying process that is creating the data introducing bias in the data? Secondly, we have to question the sample. Is my sample representative or is it a bias sample? Third, for example, we have to understand and question the data integration, which itself might introduce bias into the data. Once we are almost sure of the data bias and how to remove them, we have to also think of the algorithm or the model bias, because every algorithm that we use brings its own bias into the system. So we need to compare algorithms. We need to stress test the outcomes to see that the model is fair to different demographics and racial components, for example. In terms of accountability, we need to know what input creates what kind of output, which means that we might have to create simpler models that are explainable. Now, you might be thinking, are my simpler models better, or are they going to compromise on accuracy? It is possible that it might compromise on accuracy a little bit, but in our research, we have found that simpler models do not necessarily compromise on accuracy. Sometimes we have been able to beat, in many cases, for example, the Netflix threshold of 10% in a large number of their movies. The other important takeaway from simpler explainable models is that they can now be interpreted for decision making, something that we were not able to do in past AI models. So the last point about transparency and accountability is that we need to be transparent what goes into our model. We need to be transparent how we create our model. Okay? And the customer nowadays is asking more and more to respect their privacy and confidentiality. What does it mean for us in developing AI models? It might mean that we might have to put limited and less attributes into the model that is creating and doing the prediction. It might also mean that we might have to put up some data points. Now, you may be thinking, is it going to decrease the accuracy of my model? Not necessarily. But what it is going to do, if we are transparent with the customer, is that they are going to accept and trust the AI that is being used with their data and that they are consuming. So once that trust comes in, the AI will be much more acceptable to the consumer, and that is how the business can prosper. So let us take a look at an example of AI being used in the healthcare domain that will be presented next.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sudip. I think that's very interesting, and we'll get to your questions afterward. If you have any, you can put them in the chat now of Sudip. I know that what he covered is kind of deep, very interesting, and I think transparency is so important. Anish, you've recently worked with a large healthcare provider in Massachusetts who wanted help in taming that data beast, so to speak, so they could better help patients. You helped to create a centralized registry where primary care physicians and specialists, care managers, and other authorized stakeholders could find timely versions of all available data about the patient in one convenient user interface. Of course, the goal was to improve care. Tell us about that platform and how it was developed using AI and ML, which really has become a great use case for AI and ML.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you everyone for joining today. Good morning, Dr. Sudip. Good to see you. And I wanted to highlight some of the success stories that we have done with our client, who is a major hospital in the Western Massachusetts area, right? And as Dr. Sudip pointed, right? So it's not about the volume of data, it's about the quality of the data and the data that fit for the purpose, right? And the team that I was part of, which is called the data management and analytics, right? We spent first few years to prepare the data, right? So there are the client being a hospital, right? So they had many 100+ clinical applications, and we have to basically work on building a centralized repository where we have to bring in the data from multiple systems, integrate the data, clean up the data where we have data quality issues, do some master data management, do some reference management and things like that, right? And that data now becomes a foundation, and we work with various departments within the hospital, like the quality department, the patient safety department, the research and development department, right, in supplying the data that would meet for their reporting needs, regulatory needs, for their predictive analytics and things like that, right? And moving on to the next slide. Can you please go to the next slide? I wanted to highlight one of the project, right? So during my tenure with this client, which is about 8+ years, I've worked on several projects, and I wanted to pick a couple of them to highlight as a success story here, right? Along with this, we were involved in various other projects, including the ones that are directly affected on the COVID pandemic, right? So like my team was kind of the responsible for providing the reporting data to the state of Massachusetts Department of Health on the COVID cases, the number of vaccinations we did, right? And we are also working towards building a registry of all the COVID patients, right? That's the most recent one we have done. Prior to that is like as a hospital, they also own an accountable care organization where they have to manage the high-risk patients, right? So there is a ask here to easily identify or build a cohort of patient population based on their clinical condition, right? One example is the COPD, right? COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, right? It's a lung-related problem, and it was estimated about close to 7% of US population is affected with COPD. And primary causes include the tobacco smoke, the environmental factors, the air pollutants, and things like that, right? And the major problem that our client had is the data was stored in disparate sources, right? And there isn't an easier way to get to the patient list. They were not able to manage their patient. They were not able to understand their gaps in care and things like that. And can you move on to the next slide? And we come up with a solution where we build a centralized repository where we could bring in the patient population, right? And then we build some algorithm to understand which are the high-risk patients, right? So we use their lab results for COPD. Spirometry is one of the lab which is considered to understand how well your lung is performing. And we used like several data points like their vital signs, their demographics, and things like that to stratify the patients to high, medium, and low risk. So this helps to manage the patients who are need the utmost care, right? And also we were able to figure out which patients have gaps in care, like which patients needs more attention. It helps them to plan and prepare the patient outreach program. And I have listed some of the technology stacks which we used for solutioning this particular project. Can you move on to the next slide? With respect to today's topic, right, I wanted to bring a success story which we did related to the predictive analytics. The state have granted for one of our chief pulmonologists a grant of $3+ million, right? And they wanted to identify high-risk asthma patients. The reason being is just before the COVID pandemic hit, like in the year of 2019, Springfield, Massachusetts was ranked as the #1 in high asthma prevalence and high asthma related emergency visit, right? And we need to come up with an efficient way to figure out which patients are the frequent flyers, who come into our ED, who clog our ED system, right? And we used a machine learning, right? If you move on to the next slide, we selected the patient population based on certain criteria, like anybody who's age greater than 2, and then the clients, they should have a primary care provider in that area. They should have an emergency visit. So based on certain qualification, we were able to identify the patient population. And then there was a med to vec algorithm. This is an algorithm that was published in a journal, right? And then we adapted that algorithm to build a machine learning model. And then we trained the model using this patient population. And then our objective was here to basically identify the patients who are high risk and patients who are more prone to come into our ED. So we try to score them based on who have the higher probability of coming into our ED. If we can go to the next slide, please. So based on our study, right? So this was a very short-term project, 6 to 8 weeks project, where we have to quickly give them the high-risk patient list. And we were able to give the score with a specificity of 88%. And using that score, what the folks did is they were able to do some patient outreach, enroll them for some trials, right? Come up with some program to basically improve their health, right? So this was done to identify which are high-risk patients, which are more prone to come into our ED. This is a good example of how we could use the machine learning, which we have used in the real world, and we could help the community in saving patients' lives. Thank you.
It's a great example, Anis, and if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. I know somebody had asked, what is med to vev, or is it med to vec? Someone had asked that, so I don't know if it
so this is this is an algorithm which is published in a journal which is related to building a machine learning. So we adapted that algorithm from that journal to build our model.
Awesome. And it's a great case of and Sudip, I want to bring you back into it. And if you guys have any questions, please put them in the chat. But it's a really good case of healthcare and how data and analytics is saving lives. I think I heard you mention, Anis, maybe not today, but in prior conversations with you, that I think Springfield went up from on the asthma thing. They used to be #1 in the nation, and with the data, you were able to make predictions and help improve care, which moved them down on that list. Correct?
Yes. So I can talk about that a little bit, right? So in year 2019, Springfield was ranked #1, right? And there were like steps taken by the local community, the town, the state, right? So there were some grants specifically provided, and the hospital wanted to identify the high-risk patients so that they can focus on certain patients, right, which are considered as frequent flyers. And they built some programs such as like patient outreach program to improve their living condition, right? Some of them were living in a very bad neighborhood with molds in their house, with air pollutants. The quality of the air was bad, right? So they did some funding to improve those patients' life. And actually, based on those steps, Springfield was rated as #12. So they went from #1 to #12 in year 2022, right? So this is how the data that we have supplied really worked in the real world situation, where they were able to take the data, identify the high-risk patients, and able to take some necessary actions so that we could see some changes in real world.
Okay. And I think we have a question. It says, can you explain the significance of the ROC curve, and in the context of your use case, how do you use it and define what success looks like?
Yeah, so this was primarily used to like understand the specificity, how well this scores could adapt, like the probability of understanding the like which are the high risk patients, right? So this was used to understand the clustering behind which population that needs to be focused.
Sudip, I wanted to bring you back in. Thank you very much, Anis. It's interesting. Obviously, we've given a healthcare example here today, but explainable AI and artificial intelligence can be used across all industries. Talk about that and how it's kind of changing the way decision makers, because I know we have some decision makers on the call today, and how it's kind of changing. What do leaders need to know?
That's a great question. So as we see, AI has impacted us in all different business areas, from healthcare to operations to transportation, and including personal areas of food, romance, photography, and everything, right? And that is the reason why everybody is asking for a better explanation of why these decisions are being imposed on them. So, for example, in the area of photography, which almost all of us do with our cell phones and others, we may not be aware of it, but most of the data that is being used to train those AI models that look at the light falling onto a small chip and converting them into images, most of those data come from one segment of the population that used to take pictures for the last, let's say, 100 years, and that is mostly people who had whiter kind of skin. And that is where the data comes from, and it is very interesting that most of those models actually can depict different facets of whiter skin much better than they can figure out the facets of brown and black and other kinds of skin. So that gives us a interesting perspective of when we do not know what goes into the model and how the model is created, we do not have any trust in the output or the outcome of the model. And now that AI is being used in our businesses, in our lives, and in the legal area, in the insurance area, we are being asked, how does your model work? Why does your model work? What input actually produces that output? And we should be in a position to explain that. And that's why many companies in different industries are working to create models that are more open, not a black box anymore. And we have done some work on that itself, and we are following that FAT principle to try open the AI black box and make it into an open box model.
Looks like you're on mute, Tracy.
It's definitely evolving, that's for sure. We do have another question. It might be for Anis. It says, is the asthma use case a good use case for explainable AI, or the use of vectoral representation? Will it make it impossible to extract tractable value? Anis, can you say something to that? Someone asked this question. Can you?
Yeah, I think so, right? Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
All right. Yeah, I would personally think this would be a good example for doing an explainable AI, right? So the model that we built was following to an extent what Dr. Sudip was mentioning, right? It was not complex. We didn't we tried to be fair with respect to the demographics, right? The area itself has a lot of people of color, people under poverty line and things like that. We took the fairness into the consideration as well, right? And also the data that we've dealt with is not like a large volume data. We didn't use big data there, right? We used like a small subset of data, which is more fitting to the purpose, right? So I would definitely think we could adapt certain like the pointers that Dr. Sudip shared today in our future project also, right? And we will definitely share these with our R&D department so that they could also adapt on the explainable AI.
Sure. We have one last question. Dr. Sudip, can you take that one real quick? Because it's around the FAT model around explainable AI.
Yes, that's a great question. So the question is the FATE model around explainable AI already a widely adopted model, or is it more in its infancy stage? Are these assets checks or assessments that can help practitioners assess how well a particular model performs against the FATE model? Yes. So the FAT model, Singapore actually explicitly states that AI should be fair, accountable, and transparent. It's in the law. The EU also has these 3 criteria of fairness, accountability, and transparency in its list of 7 key requirements that AI systems should meet. The US also, through its national AI innovation framework, is incorporating these as part of what AI models should be working towards. So this is not in its infancy. It is being there are also several research that has already been done, including ours, where we bring in the whole framework of fairness, accountability, and transparency together. And the question is that what are some of the ways that can help practitioners to assess how a particular model can perform against the FATE? So it is not that a particular model's accuracy is linked to FATE. The way we figure out is that, for example, the data coming into, is the data fair? Is the data unbiased to a large extent? The models that we use, are the models fair and unbiased? Then the question comes, can we explain the model? Is it transparent enough that the inputs and can be explained in terms of how it determines the outputs, for example? So if we can do all those phases, you will then know that yes, the model is fair. It is not biased against any demographics. It is accountable because we know that the inputs and the outputs can be explained on how the different inputs create the outputs, and also the transparency factor of what goes into it and how the model is created can be explained to not only the CEOs, but also to the customers. Hope that answers the question.
And I think it does, but we're out of time, but we do have another question I wanted to get to. We can extend. It says, we have implemented AI, but how do we know the model which we have used falls under explainable AI? So let's answer that one, and then we'll let people go, because I don't want to hold people too much longer than.
Correct. So the last question, how do we know that the model which we have used falls under explainable AI? So if your model is only focused on accuracy and it is difficult to explain to people how the model works or why the model works, then it is probably not an explainable model. But if your model, if you can assure that your model is fair, if you can assure and explain why your model works in terms of what kind of inputs create what kind of outputs and the mechanism that the input and output uses the input uses to create the output, then it would be called an explainable model. So if we in short takeaway is that if you're only focusing on accuracy, your model may not be an explainable model.
This is definitely a topic we could debate forever, but Sudip and Anish, you guys have been such great panelists. We certainly appreciate you being here and giving us your time today to try to explain explainable AI. It's a topic that we'll hear much more of in the future. Thank you all for attending, to all those who registered and attended. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We do have these webinars every quarter, so stay tuned. We'll send you what our next theme will be. And if you know of anyone who might enjoy this webinar, we will be sending out the recording to you all. Please pass it along. Have a great day, and thanks for your time. And there are some emails on the screen now. If you'd like to email Anish or myself, we would certainly get any questions you have to Dr. Sudip as well. And thank you all for attending. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.